Hello, my name is Lusterquin. Today I'm going to give you a walkthrough of my track The Grim of War, which was released as part of my album Civil War at the end of 2018, literally the end, December 31st. The Grim of War, specifically, is a story that is told through the medium that is music. And what I mean by this is that the track itself has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And you could think of that as the beginning being Act 1, the middle being Act 2, all of which lead to the ending being Act 3. If you have not yet listened to this piece, I would encourage you to do so. I'm going to try and avoid playing it too much throughout this walkthrough for two reasons. The first reason, as you can clearly not take your eyes off of, the CPU meter is going quite a bit insane. This is because the Grim of War is a very, very resource CPU intensive file. This is a very large project and it uses a lot of resources. Trying to record this walkthrough is ergo a challenge. The second reason, however, is because due to the structure of the Grim of War, with it being a story told through sound, I want the listening experience to remain fresh for you if you've not yet listened to it. In this video, though, I'm going to go over a few of the techniques that I used to create it. The track very much is a type of trance music, even though it hops around through tempo changes quite a bit. And so what I'm going to do is first break down the structure a little bit. So the FLP that we're looking at here is actually just part 1. The reason that this is only part 1 is because due to some of the limitations in FL Studio and my computer, I knew I'd have to break the production apart into two pieces in order to work on it without running into problems. And you can see, even just with my CPU just going like this, we haven't even started playing yet, and it's already kind of maxing out here. So I'll apologize in advance. Anytime I start playing, it's going to be choppy, but maybe that's okay, because it's going to make the listening experience much better once you actually go to the actual track and hear it, if you have not yet. So what we're going to do is kind of break apart the structure of the track a little bit, and I'm going to kind of go over a few techniques that I use to make it. So I mentioned earlier, it's broken into basically 3 acts. The first act is about 3 minutes long. This is the intro. It goes from bars 1 to about 100, or 97, and throughout that it's at 120 beats per minute. This is the sort of orchestral horror thematic opening of the piece. At bar 97, I think, it switches over to 133 beats per minute, a standard tempo for trance music. And this whole section here that you're looking at, then all the way up until the end of part 1, which ends at about 8 minutes and 47 seconds? Around 8:43. This is the trance. This is the part of the track that follows some of those rules of trance music. This entire section is basically a build-up towards the ending here. This ending, you would think, upon first listening to it, that it is the end of the track, and indeed it functions as such. But it actually is not, and this has to do with the thematic elements of the Grim of War as a story, right? You think it's the end because it is supposed to be the end, but in fact it is not. And as you continue to listen, you start to see the direction that the story takes in part 3. Part 3, it switches to 165 beats per minute, I believe. We're not going to be looking at the FLP for that today, however. This continues until the end of the actual production, which is about 13:11. All right. So it is a very long piece of music. You will need to set aside some time listening to it, but just think of it as watching a short film, because that is essentially the function of this piece. Before we dive in, I'm going to give you some abstract information just about the FLP itself, some things you might be wondering. I mentioned this was a large project file, but just how large? To those limitations that I was mentioning earlier, FL Studio only allows you 125 mixer tracks per file, and in most cases, this is perfectly fine. Not for the Grim of War. In Part 1, we use a total of 120 mixer track channels. See? In parts 1 and 2, but from here on out I'm going to just refer to this file as Part 1, and then the second file as Part 2, or Blue Memory, which is what I've entitled it here. In Part 2, / Blue Memory, a similar number is used. So the Grim of War uses a total of about 240 mixer channels. Okay. Some history to that, though. Blue Memory was created 3 years ago. I created this before Part 1 here was even conceptualized. I created this scene, if you will, this ending sequence, unsure of what it was supposed to be. And as such, I built it up into just this massive thing before I had any knowledge that the rest of this project would come into existence. So it does have some historical significance as well, and that's also partially why the projects are split in this way. And you may be wondering, well, why are there so many mixer channels in use? And you may have begun to notice why as I've sort of jumped around here. I'm going to show you the playlist in a second. Notice how everything in the mixer moves as I sort of slide through the playlist here. Almost everything in this track is automated. Automation is one of the most important techniques that I use in order to create movement in the track. Every individual sound has its own set of parameters that I move around in order to bolster the atmosphere that the Grim of War creates. One of the most essential characteristics for me in trance music is to create an atmosphere, right? To create a world that you can immerse yourself within and experience. In order to do that, you have to have movement. And so automation, there's quite a bit of automation in this track. Just how much? I'm going to just zoom all the way out here to make this a little easier to scroll through. And I guess I will just move this like this. I want you to pay close attention, though, to all these colored blocks here. Almost all of this is actually automation. Take a look. And we clock out right down here about 129 tracks. And you'll notice that a lot of it is grouped together. So for example, if we look here, this is probably one of the densest parts of the track. I've grouped a lot of the automation for each individual sound together. So for this gold saw, I'm automating the volume. I'm also automating the panning and the modulation X and the modulation Y. One of them is the detuning, and the other, I believe, is the resonance, or the filter. I think it might be the filter, actually. We'll have to double check that. And in here, I use a very specific technique as well. Through many sounds in here, and you can actually even pick a couple more out here. Here's another one here. I have these wet and dry levels that I use for reverbs on different sounds. And what I do with this technique is I decrease the dry level as I increase the wet level, and I'm going to show you that a little bit. So what this does is it leaves a lot of the stereo information in the sound, but it reduces a lot of that sort of dry input signal so that what you're left with is just that reverberated saturation. And because there is so much stereo information in that wet level, because a lot of these reverbs I have, you'll notice that I give them quite a bit of additional stereo separation. And this is, again, to create very atmospheric effects through the individual sounds. Again, I'm going to hesitate to play much of this, but I will attempt to show you what I mean a little bit later. If we go over to here, I'm going to show you just the breakdown of the individual channels in this piece. The total number of channels is quite a staggering number. If you right-click on the final channel, making sure that you are in the All Selection Filter group, you can click Rename and see how many channels you have. Part 1 has 552, and Part 2 has about 360 or so, which means that the Groom of War has somewhere between 900 and 1,000 channels. Out of those 1,000 channels, more than half of them are automation. We do have a selection of audio files here, quite a bit of them. These are mostly used as effects, explosions, and other little elements here. Then I have some big drums. These are orchestral drums. I use the pack Epic Drums 2 for all of these samples, and then I use East-West Storm Drum 3 for some of these other sounds that I have here. This is the Lord of Toms, for example. Very powerful drums there. So I use these very sparingly, while this wall of sounds that you're looking at here makes up the principal drum arrangement. You'll notice also that there appear to be very similar variances to the samples, also very intentional. Each sound is a little bit different. And so by sort of alternating, and I'll try and show you an example of this if I can find one. Let's see here. If I can show you this. Okay, so take a look at this pattern. I use variations of these drums to give it a more realistic feel. Basically, if you play the exact same sample over and over and over again, it's going to sound very electronic, very simulated, not quite realistic. That's why I use a variation of the same sound. So for example, here, I use this big hit, then I use, after that, a variation of that big hit. They're a little bit different. This one as well, and this one. B signifies the type of drum. C is a different drum, and A is yet a different drum. These are lower sounds. These are coming from the right, and then these are panned to the left. Okay? And now you can kind of hear what I mean about the choppiness due to the CPU. Next I have a section on brass instruments. Drums, kick-ass being the main kick drum here. It's actually a layer. Right now it's in a state where I've got a little bit of, you can see I have a crusher on it. The D Blue crusher is what I use here. This is actually 2 layers here. I use this sound for the body of it, and then I use this sound, although I'll have to turn it up because you don't quite hear it yet. This is that very sort of sharpness that gives the kick a little bit more of a texture here, a little bit more punch, if you will. While this sample makes up a lot of the body of the kick drum, it is this sample, this sharp section, that gives it a lot of that punch in the high end. Notice how I've EQ'd it to really emphasize some of that high end while getting rid of the low end. That's because in this sample, the kick-ass, the small kick-ass, I'm emphasizing the sort of the bass aspects of it. And this is actually automated, this low frequency here. And you can actually see it right here. Here is that automation clip. When we start the trance section, the kick drum starts, and I'll attempt to play this. You'll see that there is some bass information coming through, but it's not all there yet. And this is to create a kind of a build-up effect, to build a little bit of tension. The kick is much tighter in this state. Once it gets here, the bass is fully present. Okay. And then I've got some other things here, some closed hi-hats, and for some reason I have a bass in here as well. This is the principal orchestral section. I have some violins, cellos. I'm using different east-west instruments for this. Tremolo, a piano, some choirs. All of these red channels are articulations for the, this is the technique that I use to create, to simulate the key switches in some of these individual east-west instruments. So for these first violins, each of these key switches here, by using this articulate plugin, what I can actually do is link the, so for example, I can take each of these articulations here and route it to the key switch that matches the one in the plugin. All I have to do is set the port in the channel to match the port in the channel that are in here. Oh, wrong section there. Let me just show you here. Input port is 1, output port is 1. I just set everything to 1, and then so for example in the second violins I would set it to 2 and so on. And that's how you get them to link up. Then I can just set the key switch key to match the one that is here. So like the sustain I've got at C, and then I have this one also at C. This is the sustain. That's how I do a lot of these orchestral instruments. I've got second violins, long violins, some effects down here and such. This is all east-west instruments, all of this. But then I also have a section where I'm not using east-west instruments. That is the strings. These are all direct wave samples. And these are additional instruments. These are mostly heard in the first section, the first act, the orchestral intro. Other percussion, we've got just some snares and such. Unsorted, nothing is unsorted because it's all nicely organized. Basses, this is only one of them. The rest are, well, we saw one of them in the drums section for some reason, and then another one is in here. In the sounds, I have pretty much everything electronic. Okay, so that's a little bit of a breakdown of that. So I've already kind of gone over a few things. What I want to focus some attention on is this section. This is what I call the wall of sound. Now, the wall of sound, the reason I call it this is because one of the techniques I've used is influenced by an old music production formula by the same name. Back in the 1960s, a musician by the name of Phil Spector sort of came up with the formula. And what was theorized by it was that if you layer a certain number of sounds on top of each other, you create a single, richer instrument, a richer profile of sound, a texture, if you will, that makes the music sound quite a bit fuller. In other words, if I, for example, and I'll show you kind of what this means. Take a look at this pattern. In this pattern, I have two of the exact same sound, or I'm sorry, two of the exact same chord progression layered on top of one another, two different sounds. So I'm just going to focus on, sorry, didn't mean for that to be so quite abrupt. I'm going to focus on this section for just a moment. I'm going to start playing it a bit. Actually, what I'm going to do, so that you can hear a lot of the movement taking place, is I'm going to go in here and solo just this sound. You'll notice also that I've routed them to these same mixer channels, so they're both getting the same movement here. The movement's actually different though because I just used, in this case, I'm not automating anything inside here. So I'm just using a single EQ to cut out some of this, the mid frequency here. And I believe I automate this? Yes, I do. So this fifth band here, this is kind of a middle band, I automate this to create some phasing effects throughout. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to just kind of try and listen to this, even though it is going to be a little choppy, try and focus on some of the movement that's taking place. So it is quite a bit difficult to try and sit through that, I understand. But let's observe a few things that are happening here. First, I have the panning envelope set all the way to the right side here. Then I have it pan very quickly, or I'm sorry, I think I said the right side. It's actually, yeah, pan to the right side here, and then it immediately switches over very abruptly to the left. Now, as we observe this, we have to also observe the effect, the relationship that has with the other sounds. Take a look at the panning envelope above that. As I pan these two sounds to the right, I pan this sound, acid 2, to the left. Let's enable acid 2 and observe how this affects the sound a bit. Okay. So you notice that already, just by automating the panning, we create a lot of dynamic movement in the sound. There are a couple other things that we're automating, and these are mostly, again, just to bolster this movement. I mentioned the band 5 frequency on the detuned saw. That's what this envelope is, and that is just changing or accentuating different parts of the, or actually it's removing different parts of the filter frequency spectrum to give it a bit of a phasing effect. We've also got some modulation here on the acid sound, and we also have modulation here on the detuned saw and on the decadent sounds. Now this modulation, there's so many sounds I can't keep track of what everything is, but we can take a look here in Citrus. This detuned saw, the modulation X, this is the cutoff, and then the resonance, and I automate both again to give it some movement throughout. And then on the decadent, I have also the low pass cutting, band pass cutting. That's what the Y is. So I'm kind of following along to try and make sense of where we're at here. Yeah, so there is a low pass and a band pass filter happening here. That's these two envelopes. Okay, and you'll notice, I want you to kind of notice a bit of behavior with these two envelopes. They don't exactly contrast each other, but their behaviors are slightly opposite in some sections. So for example here, as I notice in the modulation window, there's kind of a diagonal movement going on. As the modulation Y increases, the modulation X decreases. What that means is that the low pass cutoff is decreasing while the band pass cutoff is increasing. Again, this isn't stagnant throughout. It's actually quite random. But it does give the sound a little bit more character because we've got all these different sort of cutoff frequencies moving around. And it's not as easy to hear here in this case because of the CPU, of course. It makes it a little difficult to hear because it's a bit choppy. What else do we have going on? Master level, this is a volume envelope. This is another volume envelope. And again, this is filter frequency for the acid sound. The reason I started with these two sounds is because these are two prominent sounds, but they're not very loud. We're going to take a moment back here, and I want you to kind of focus on just how loud they actually are. So these two sounds are not very loud at all, actually. They leave a lot of headroom, and that's the point. See, with this wall of sound theory, we need to be careful that with the amount of sounds that we're layering, and in fact we do layer quite a lot of sounds in this section. Most of these sounds, in fact, are here. We have to be careful not to saturate the headroom such that you no longer are able to experience that fullness, right? In other words, if we made every sound super loud, all it would really sound like is a bunch of noise. There would not be any headroom for the sounds to move around, and you wouldn't really be able to pick up on those details nonetheless. And so we have to be careful. That's why all of the individual sounds here are not very loud, because by leaving much headroom, that gives me more creative freedom to offer a more complex arrangement. So for example here, the amount of detail that goes into some of these automations, you wouldn't really be able to audibly hear if I had saturated the signal. Now the end signal is quite loud, of course, but the individual signals are not loud, meaning not a single sound overpowers another. And that's what we kind of do down here with these volume faders, is we do quite a bit of gain staging, so that we can try to equalize the amplitude of each of these sounds as best we can. Now, in addition to amplitude, we also focus on the frequency spectrum, and I talked about this a little bit. I'm going to turn the attention now to this red and yellow section. What I have here is a collection of 3X OSC instrument plugins. And these three elements are mostly, again, to add to the wall of sound. These are not intended to be appreciated as individual instruments. And that is a key aspect and fundamental part of creating this sort of atmospheric, this very textured sound, is that you work with the sounds individually in order to create a whole sound. I know that's not the best explanation, but basically what we're doing is we're looking at what can each individual sound bring to the table, and then how can we best blend all of that together. And so this will make a little bit more sense as we kind of talk about it. A, B, and C is what I've called these, and I'm just going to play them. They're all routed to 102. Let's listen to what this sounds like by itself. That's A. That's B. This is C. Oh. So these are very high frequency sounds. So these sounds, once we sort of enable everything else here, and I'll attempt to play this, but you'll notice that you're not going to be able to, you'll hear them for sure. But what I want you to observe is how much the sound changes once I turn them off. Okay, so I'm going to start playing this as best I can, and I'm going to mute it shortly after we start so you can hear the difference. Okay, so hopefully you were able to pick up on that difference. What these three sounds do is they add to the high frequency range that is otherwise lacking in a majority of the other sounds. And it's lacking purposefully. Let's take a look at another one of the pieces in here. Let's see. I'm just going to do this just for comparison's sake. Let's look at this sound. What is this one? How about this one? So here we have some choirs. Figure out where that is here. Okay. So with the choirs, I'm going to put this side by side because I want to really look at these frequency spectrums and kind of show you what the function is here. And actually, let me pull that other sound back. The decadent sound. I think that was 112 detune saw. Here it is. Okay, there's this one, and then we'll also pull the acid. Okay. This is going to be a little confusing to look at, so I will try and make sense of it as we go through, but I am showing you something here. Okay. And let's pull another one. What else? Okay. This should be good for now. Why don't we start with this, just to make some sense of what we're looking at. When we create this wall of sound, we have to be careful to not oversaturate certain parts of the frequency spectrum. In other words, we have to mix it very well. And that's a key fundamental part of the mixing process, is you do your best to make everything sound and mix together and blend as good as you possibly can make it sound. And a lot of that has to do with how you balance your lows, your mids, and your highs. And so I've pulled aside a few sounds that occur here, and we're going to just quickly look at how they interact. So, and I'm trying to think of a way that I can do this to show this to you. Notice the acid and the detuned saw sounds we played earlier. If I manually phase this, you'll notice that it cuts out certain parts of that frequency spectrum while it's playing. Don't think I've automated this. The acid sound, that is, let's take a look at where that is. Let's try and find that here. Here. Okay. Acid, I don't know what I just did. I don't know. Okay. Acid, where is acid at? I think the acid. I don't know what happened to the acid. Where is the acid? This one. Oh, it was the pattern right behind it. See, if I had just known that. Okay, let's play this. Okay, so notice how there's a lot of focus on the mid-range here. I purposefully cut out the low end, and I also reduced the high end to put focus on the mid-range here, the middle part of this. With the choirs, I also cut out the low end, and I put more emphasis on these the mid and high regions. The kick drum, once we fully, or wait, this is not the right. This is not the right one, I don't think. We'll go to, for example, the basses. Let's pull up the basses now, so you can I can kind of put these side by side. Here's the sub bass. Okay, that's the sub bass, and then this is the mid bass. Okay, so let's put all these side by side. I am going to play the entire track in a minute so you can watch all of this. Okay. So I cut out the bass, the low frequencies in a lot of these sounds that are happening here. If I oversaturate the mid frequency, or the low frequencies, two things will happen. One, the bass and the kick drums will not be as audibly clear, which will result in the track sounding very muddy. And the second thing that will happen is that the signal will become very oversaturated very quickly. And so I'm very careful to cut out those lows to leave room for the sub bass here, the mid bass, which focuses on the mid section here. I do allow a little bit of the bass in, but a lot of this is cut off, as is the high frequency here. And then the kick drum, which is the bass is side changed to the kick drum as well. Now, for the section that we were talking about earlier before I went off on a tangent, those little high frequencies, notice that I peak the high frequency a little bit to give it a little bit of extra cushioning, I guess you could say. because in a lot of these sections, the high frequencies are quite a bit lacking, where they're not really emphasized that much. Only the choirs open that up a bit. But if we play the choirs, and I'm going to attempt to locate them in this playlist. It's not, nope, that's a different sound. That is not the choirs. Where are the choirs? Here we are. If I play these, you'll notice that there really isn't that much here in the high frequency spectrum. And so because of that, we have to add some of that high frequency back. That is the reason that we use these three different really ear-piercing sounds to add texture to this wall of sound. And of course I automate the volume, the panning for all three sounds individually. But that's the purpose. What I'm going to do now is attempt to play this so that you can take a moment to visualize all of this at play. Notice also that this spectrum is moving as well. Okay.